Murder in Bishopsgate Square. Chapter 1. The Tolling Bells. I have always maintained that November is the most disagreeable of months, and that particular evening in 1931 seemed determined to prove my point. The fog hung thick as a shroud over London, transforming familiar streets into mysterious passages where gas lamps flickered like dying stars. I had called upon my old friend Hercule Poirot at his flat in Whitehaven Mansions, seeking the warmth of his sitting room and the comfort of companionable conversation. Poirot sat in his favourite armchair, immaculate as always despite the lateness of the hour. His patent leather shoes gleamed, his moustaches were perfectly waxed, and he was arranging his correspondence with mathematical precision. The fire crackled cheerfully, casting dancing shadows across the room's orderly surfaces. "Mon ami," he said without looking up from his letters, "you have the expression of a man who finds the English climate particularly trying this evening." "Dash it all, Poirot," I replied, settling into the chair opposite him. "It's positively ghastly out there. Can barely see one's hand in front of one's face." "Precisely," murmured Poirot, placing his final letter exactly parallel to the others. "Such weather, it conceals many things, does it not? But it also reveals them to those who know how to look." Before I could ask what he meant by this characteristically cryptic observation, a sharp rap came at the door. Miss Lemon had long since departed for the evening, so Poirot rose with a slight frown to answer it himself. I heard the familiar gruff voice of Inspector Japp in the hallway. "Sorry to disturb you at this hour, Mr. Poirot, but we've got ourselves a nasty business in Bishopsgate Square, the sort of thing that might benefit from your particular methods." Poirot's green eyes brightened with interest. "Ah, mon bon Japp, please enter. And what is the nature of this nasty business?" Japp stepped into the room, his coat dripping with moisture, his usually cheerful face grim with concern. "Murder, Mr. Poirot. Sir Reginald Hawthorne, found dead not 2 hours ago. Looks like a robbery gone wrong, but there's something about the whole setup that doesn't sit right with me." "Sir Reginald Hawthorne," repeated Poirot thoughtfully. "The shipping magnate. A man of considerable wealth and influence, I believe. That's the one. Made plenty of enemies in his time, both in Parliament and the City, but this wasn't done by some footpad in a dark alley. This was in Bishopsgate Square. You know the place, Mr. Poirot? Used to be quite the fashionable address, but it's gone to seed rather badly. I knew Bishopsgate Square by reputation, though I had rarely occasion to visit it. Once the preserve of wealthy merchants and minor nobility, it had declined significantly in recent years, as the more affluent residents moved to newer, more fashionable districts. "Most interesting," murmured Poirot, already reaching for his overcoat. "And what makes you think this was not the simple robbery it appears?" Japp looked uncomfortable. "Well, that's just it, isn't it? The whole thing feels theatrical, like someone wanted to make sure we'd all take notice." 20 minutes later, our taxi deposited us at the entrance to Bishopsgate Square. The fog seemed even thicker here, if possible, swirling around the wrought-iron railings and lamp-posts like ghostly dancers. The square itself was a rectangular garden surrounded by Georgian houses, their once proud facades now showing the unmistakable signs of genteel decay. Paint peeled from window frames, and several of the gas lamps had been extinguished, leaving pools of impenetrable darkness. At the centre of the square stood an ancient church, its Norman tower rising into the fog like an accusing finger. The church bells had fallen silent now, but I could almost hear their echo in the heavy air. "There," said Japp, pointing toward the ornate gates that marked the square's main entrance. Several constables stood guard, their bull's-eye lanterns casting eerie circles of yellow light. "That's where we found him. The body of Sir Reginald Hawthorne lay slumped against the iron bars, his silk hat fallen beside him, his silver-tipped walking cane lying at an odd angle near his feet. Even in the uncertain light, the dark stain across his waistcoat was unmistakable. He had been a large man, well-dressed and prosperous in appearance, though death had robbed him of any dignity he might have possessed in life. Poirot approached the scene with his characteristic careful steps, his keen eyes taking in every detail. He did not touch the body immediately, but stood for several minutes in silent contemplation, his head tilted slightly to one side. "The church bells," he said suddenly. "At what time did they toll?" "That's the odd thing," replied Japp. "According to the residents, they rang out at 23 minutes past 10. Most unusual hour for church bells, wouldn't you say? It was the sound that brought everyone out of their houses. That's when the body was discovered." "Most suggestive," murmured Poirot. "And the residents? They all heard these bells?" "Every last one of them. Queer thing is, the vicar says he didn't ring them, claims the bell rope was tampered with somehow, though he can't explain how." As if summoned by our conversation, several figures began to emerge from the surrounding houses. First came a tall, elegant woman of perhaps 60, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the late hour, and her bearing unmistakably aristocratic. She wore a black velvet cloak that had seen better days, but still retained an air of quality. "That's Lady Margaret Ashworth," Japp murmured to us. "Lives at number 12. Been here longer than anyone, I'm told." Behind her came a nervous-looking gentleman with a medical bag clutched tightly in his hands, followed by a younger woman with dark hair and anxious eyes. Finally, a stocky man in working clothes approached, wringing a cloth cap between his hands. Each face, illuminated briefly by the constable's lanterns, bore the unmistakable stamp of secrets closely guarded. In the swirling fog and uncertain light, they seemed less like residents of a respectable London square than actors in some macabre theatrical production. Poirot straightened slowly, his gaze moving from the corpse to the assembled residents and back again. His expression was thoughtful, almost pleased, as though he had recognized the opening moves of a particularly challenging game of chess. Chapter 2. The Residents of the Square. The fog seemed to part reluctantly as the residents of Bishopsgate Square gathered around the scene of the crime. Poirot, with his characteristic methodical approach, suggested that Inspector Japp conduct the preliminary interviews in Lady Margaret's drawing-room. Hers was the largest residence, and she appeared to be the acknowledged senior member of their small community. Lady Margaret Ashworth's house at number 12 bore the hallmarks of faded grandeur. The entrance hall, though immaculately maintained, showed signs of careful economy. Fresh flowers in an expensive vase, but only a few stems, and fine furniture that had been reupholstered with skill but cheaper fabric. Lady Margaret herself moved with the unconscious authority of one born to command, yet I noticed how her fingers worried constantly at the worn kid gloves she wore. "Inspector," she said, settling into a high-backed chair with regal composure, "this is a most distressing business. Sir Reginald was not perhaps the most beloved member of our little community, but to meet such a violent end—" She left the sentence unfinished, but her pale blue eyes held a steeliness that seemed at odds with her genteel manner. Poirot, who had been observing her with his usual intense attention, spoke gently. "You knew Sir Reginald well, madam?" "As well as one knows any neighbour, I suppose." Lady Margaret's voice carried the precise diction of her class, but I detected the faintest tremor beneath it. "He purchased number 3 some 5 years ago, though he used it primarily for business entertaining rather than as a proper residence." And your opinion of Sir Reginald, it was not altogether favourable." Poirot's tone remained mild, but his green eyes missed nothing. For the first time Lady Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Her grip on her gloves tightened until her knuckles showed white. "Sir Reginald was a man who believed that everything had a price, Inspector, including honour and loyalty. My late husband had certain business dealings with him. The outcome was not to our advantage." Before Poirot could pursue this further, Dr. Lionel Carroway cleared his throat nervously. He was a man of perhaps 55, with thinning sandy hair and the pallor of one who spent too much time indoors. His hands, I noticed, had a persistent tremor that he attempted to disguise by keeping them clasped firmly around his medical bag. "If I may," the doctor interjected, his voice higher than one might expect from a man of his stature, "I should mention that I examined the body briefly before the police arrived. Sir Reginald appears to have died from a severe blow to the head delivered with considerable force." "Ah, merci, doctor," said Poirot. "You have medical experience with such injuries?" Dr. Carroway's pale complexion grew even more wan. That is to say, in the course of my general practice, one encounters various types of trauma. Though I must admit, my practice these days is rather limited." "The doctor is being modest," Lady Margaret interjected, though there was something sharp in her tone. "Dr. Carroway once had a very successful practice in Harley Street, didn't you, doctor?" The medical man seemed to shrink into himself at these words. "That was, some time ago. Circumstances change, as I'm sure you understand." I could see that Poirot was filing away every nuance of this exchange, though his expression remained pleasantly neutral. He turned his attention to the younger woman, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, her dark eyes darting nervously between the other speakers. "And you are, mademoiselle?" "Miss Beatrice Lyle," she replied in a voice barely above a whisper. She was perhaps 30, with the sort of refined but unremarkable appearance common to governesses and companions. Her black dress was well cut, but several seasons out of fashion, and she wore no jewellery save for a simple locket at her throat. I live at number 7. I serve as governess to the Pemberton children." "The Pembertons being absent from our gathering tonight?" inquired Poirot. "They are travelling in the south of France," Miss Lyle explained. "They left me to maintain the house in their absence." Her voice caught slightly as she added, "Sir Reginald was, that is to say, he often called upon the Pembertons when they were in residence." Something in her manner suggested that Sir Reginald's visits had not been entirely unwelcome to her, though she seemed reluctant to elaborate. I observed Poirot making one of his small mental notes. Finally, we came to Arthur Pike, the caretaker, who had been standing awkwardly near the door throughout the proceedings. He was a solid, weather-beaten man of about 50, with the calloused hands of one who worked with tools and the respectful manner of a lifelong servant. "Mr. Pike," said Poirot kindly, "you have been the caretaker of Bishopsgate Square for how long?" "Going on 20 years now, sir," Pike replied, his voice carrying the accent of London's East End. "Seen it through good times and bad, I have. Though I must say, sir, it's been more bad than good of late." "And your duties? They include maintenance of all the properties?" "That's right, sir. Everything from changing the gas mantles to fixing the roof tiles. I've got keys to every house I have, in case of emergencies." Pike's honest face clouded with worry. "Which is why I can't understand how anyone got into the square tonight without my knowing. I always do my final rounds at 9:30, and everything was quiet then. Yet you mentioned to Inspector Japp that you had been working on Sir Reginald's walking cane this morning." Pike's face reddened. "Oh, that, sir. Yes, Sir Reginald brought it to me yesterday. said the silver tip was working loose. I tightened it up proper and gave it a good polish this morning. Beautiful piece of work it was. Real Malacca, with a silver head shaped like a lion's head. But I left it propped against his front door around noon, just like he asked me to. As Pike spoke, I noticed how each of the other residents avoided meeting his eyes. There was something in their collective manner that suggested they knew more about Arthur Pike's relationship with Sir Reginald than they were willing to admit. Poirot thanked each of them in turn and suggested they retire for the evening, promising to call upon them individually the following day. As they filed out of Lady Margaret's drawing-room, I was struck by the weight of secrets each seemed to carry. The fog outside had begun to thin slightly, but the atmosphere within the house remained thick with unspoken tensions and carefully guarded truths. Once we were alone with Japp, Poirot stood silently for several minutes, his egg-shaped head tilted in concentration. Finally, he moved to the window and peered out at the square, where the constables were still maintaining their vigil around the scene of the crime. The church bells had remained silent since our arrival, but somehow their very silence seemed more ominous than their earlier inexplicable tolling. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Fog. Dawn broke reluctantly over Bishopsgate Square, the fog gradually lifting to reveal the full melancholy of its decay. What had seemed mysterious in the lamplight now appeared merely shabby: cracked pavement, peeling paint, and windows that wanted washing. Yet in the clear morning air, Poirot seemed more alert than ever, his eyes bright with the particular satisfaction he displayed when presented with a puzzle worthy of his attention. "Come, Hastings," he said, adjusting his gloves with mathematical precision. "The morning light, she reveals many things that the darkness concealed. We must examine the scene once more, and then we shall pay our visits to the residents." The body had been removed, of course, but the chalk outline remained, a stark reminder of Sir Reginald's violent end. Poirot studied it for several minutes, then turned his attention to the church that dominated the square. The ancient building seemed to brood over the scene, its Norman tower casting a long shadow across the garden. "The bells, mon ami," Poirot murmured, producing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. Inspector Japp mentioned they were tampered with, most illuminating. The church proved to be unlocked, a circumstance which seemed to surprise the elderly vicar, who emerged from the vestry as we entered. The Reverend Dr. Michaels was a thin, scholarly man with ink-stained fingers and the vague manner of one whose thoughts dwelt more often on theological matters than earthly concerns. "Most irregular?" he muttered, adjusting his spectacles as Poirot explained our purpose. The bells rang entirely of their own accord, or so it seemed. I was in my study working on next Sunday's sermon when I heard them. 23 minutes past 10, most unusual hour indeed. Poirot examined the bell rope with minute attention, running his fingers along its length and testing its mechanism. "Ah," he said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Regard, Hastings, someone has attached a small device here, quite ingenious really. A delayed mechanism that would cause the bells to ring at a predetermined time. The device was so small and cunningly concealed that I might have overlooked it entirely. It appeared to be fashioned from clock parts and thin wire, the sort of thing that would require both mechanical knowledge and considerable patience to construct." "Who among your parishioners would possess such expertise?" Poirot inquired. Dr. Michaels looked troubled. Well, Mr. Pike, the caretaker has always been skilled with mechanical things, but surely you cannot suspect, that is to say, Arthur Pike has been a pillar of our small community." We left the church with Poirot's little grey cells clearly working at full capacity and began our systematic examination of the residents' homes. Lady Margaret received us in her morning room, which displayed the same careful economy, had observed the night before. Yet it was the books that caught Poirot's attention, shelf upon shelf of classical texts, many in Latin, with particular emphasis on the works of Juvenal. "You are a student of the classics, madame?" Poirot inquired, running his finger along the spines of several well-worn volumes. "My late husband was a scholar," Lady Margaret replied, her voice carefully neutral. "These were his books. I have maintained them in his memory, though I confess my Latin is rather rusty these days." One volume lay open on a small writing desk, its margins filled with annotations in a precise masculine hand. I caught a glimpse of the text, something about watchmen and watchers, before Lady Margaret firmly closed the book. "Ancient wisdom," she observed, though not always applicable to modern circumstances. Our visit to Dr. Carraway's surgery proved equally enlightening, though in a different way. The rooms above his modest practice were spartanly furnished, bearing the stamp of a man who had fallen far from more prosperous circumstances. Yet it was the surgery itself that attracted Poirot's attention. Several bottles and instruments had been recently cleaned, so recently, in fact, that they still showed watermarks. "You have been reorganizing your supplies, Doctor?" Poirot asked mildly. Dr. Carraway's nervous laugh was not entirely convincing. "One must maintain proper hygiene, you understand. In my profession, cleanliness is essential." "Naturally. And your practice, it keeps you occupied?" "Well enough," the doctor replied, though his evasive manner suggested otherwise. "The residents of the square require medical attention from time to time, and there are other patients in the neighbourhood." Miss Lyle's quarters at number 7 presented yet another puzzle. The Pembertons' house was grand but dusty, filled with the particular stillness of absent owners. Miss Lyle received us in the morning room, where she had been arranging flowers with the mechanical precision of one performing a familiar duty. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, and I noticed she avoided meeting our eyes directly. "Sir Reginald called upon the family frequently?" Poirot inquired. "When they were in residence, yes," Miss Lyle replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was attentive to their interests." "And to yours, perhaps?" The young woman's face flushed crimson. "I don't understand what you mean, Mr. Poirot." Yet when we departed, I observed a bundle of letters hidden hastily beneath some needlework. The quality of the paper and the masculine handwriting on the visible envelope suggested correspondence of a more personal nature than one might expect in a governess's possession. Our final visit was to Arthur Pike's modest quarters behind the church. The caretaker was engaged in repairing a broken gas lamp when we arrived, his tools spread with military precision on a clean cloth. His small rooms were spotlessly clean and filled with the evidence of his mechanical aptitude, clocks, small engines, and various devices in various stages of repair. "Quite the workshop you have here, Mr. Pike," I observed. "Always been handy with my hands, sir," Pike replied with evident pride. "Learned it in the army, I did. Engineering Corps. There's nothing mechanical I can't fix, given the proper tools and time." As we prepared to leave, Poirot paused beside Pike's workbench. Among the various tools and devices, I noticed several items that might well have been used to construct the bell mechanism we had discovered in the church. Our morning's investigations concluded with a return to Sir Reginald's house at number 3. The constable on duty admitted us readily, and we found ourselves in rooms that spoke eloquently of their owner's character. The furnishings were expensive but cold, chosen for effect rather than comfort. The desk drawers, when Poirot examined them with Inspector Japp's permission, revealed a correspondence that painted an unflattering picture of Sir Reginald's business practices. Most intriguing of all was a letter tucked inside Sir Reginald's coat pocket, discovered by the police surgeon but not yet fully examined. The paper was of high quality, torn across the middle, with only a few words visible in an educated hand. "Cannot allow this betrayal to continue. The residents must be warned." As we walked back across the square in the clear morning light, Poirot seemed lost in thought. The fog had lifted entirely now, revealing the full extent of the square's decline. Several houses stood empty, their windows boarded up, while others showed signs of multiple occupancy by tenants of obviously reduced circumstances. The ancient church bells remained silent, their temporary mechanism disabled, but somehow their earlier, impossible tolling seemed to echo still in the crisp November air. Chapter 4. The Caretaker's Tale. The afternoon brought Inspector Japp to Poirot's flat, his usual cheerful demeanour replaced by the grim satisfaction of a man who believes he has solved a puzzle. I had been reviewing my notes from our morning visits, trying to make sense of the various threads we had uncovered, when Japp's arrival interrupted my deliberations. "Well, Mr. Poirot," Japp announced, settling his considerable bulk into the chair opposite my friend, "I think we may have our man. It's Pike, the caretaker. Has to be." Poirot, who had been arranging his morning correspondence with characteristic precision, looked up with mild interest. "Indeed, mon bon Japp, and what has led you to this conclusion?" "Everything points to him," Japp declared, pulling out his notebook. "He had the opportunity, keys to every house, knows everyone's routine like clockwork. He had the means. That workshop of his could have produced the bell mechanism easily enough, and he's the one who handled the murder weapon that very morning. And as for motive—" Japp paused dramatically. "Well, that's where things get interesting." I found myself leaning forward, caught up despite myself in Japp's evident enthusiasm. The inspector had always been a capable officer, though perhaps lacking in Poirot's subtle psychological insights. "We've been making inquiries," Japp continued, "and it turns out our Mr. Pike isn't quite the simple, honest workman he appears to be. 20 years ago he was court-martialed from His Majesty's army. Embezzlement, if you please, caught stealing from the officers' mess fund." "Most illuminating," murmured Poirot, though his tone suggested something less than complete conviction. "And this relates to Sir Reginald Howe?" "That's the beauty of it," Japp said, his satisfaction evident. Sir Reginald knew. Had a file on Pike going back years. Seems our shipping magnate made it his business to know uncomfortable truths about people. Pike's been living in terror that his past would be exposed, ruin his position here. The theory had a certain compelling logic, I had to admit. Pike certainly possessed the mechanical skill necessary to construct the bell device, and his access to the square was unquestioned. Moreover, his nervous behaviour during our interviews suddenly took on a more sinister aspect when viewed through the lens of blackmail and desperation. "You have questioned Mr. Pike about this?" Poirot inquired. "Brought him in this morning," Japp confirmed. "And a right state he was in too. Practically collapsed when I mentioned the court-martial. Started babbling about how Sir Reginald had been bleeding him dry for months. Small amounts, mind you, but enough to hurt a man in Pike's position. I could picture the scene all too clearly. Pike, with his honest face and working man's pride, confronted with the shame of his military disgrace and the systematic exploitation that had followed. It was the sort of situation that might well drive a decent man to desperate measures. "And his account of the evening in question?" Poirot asked. "Claims he was in his rooms from 8 o'clock onward, but he's got no one to vouch for him. Says he was working on some clockwork for Lady Margaret, repairing a mantel clock, he claims, but she denies asking him to do any such work." This detail struck me as particularly damning. Pike had established mechanical expertise, a weak alibi, and now an outright contradiction with Lady Margaret's account. The case seemed to be building against him with inexorable logic. "We found something else too," Japp added, producing a small paper packet from his coat. This was hidden in Pike's workshop, tucked away behind some tools. Recognize the paper, Mr. Poirot?" Even from across the room, I could see that the paper matched the torn fragment found in Sir Reginald's coat pocket. High quality with a distinctive watermark, and bearing the same precise handwriting we had glimpsed earlier. "Most suggestive," Poirot agreed, though something in his manner suggested reservation rather than satisfaction. "And what does Mr. Pike say about this discovery?" "Denies all knowledge of it, naturally. Claims someone must have planted it there. Typical criminal response. Blames someone else when the evidence piles up." Poirot rose from his chair and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in his characteristic thinking pose. For several minutes he stood in silence, gazing out at the London street below. I had seen this behaviour many times before, and knew better than to interrupt his contemplation. "Tell me, Jap," he said finally, "this court-martial of Pike's, you have examined the records personally?" "Well, no," Jap admitted with slight embarrassment. "That is to say, the information comes from Sir Reginald's private files. Seems he made quite a hobby of collecting such things." "Ah." Poirot's tone carried a world of meaning. "And the timing of this blackmail, when did it supposedly begin?" "According to Pike's own admission, about 6 months ago. Says Sir Reginald approached him with a business proposition. That's how he put it. Started with small amounts, but recently Sir Reginald had been demanding more. Yet Pike remained in his position as caretaker throughout this period." Jap looked slightly puzzled. "Well, yes, where else would he go at his age with his record?" "Précisément," murmura Poirot. "And the residents of the square, they trusted him completely throughout this time?" "Seems so. Lady Margaret in particular speaks very highly of him, says he's been invaluable, especially since her circumstances became reduced." I could see that Poirot was building toward some point, though its nature remained obscure to me. His questions seemed to be undermining the very case that appeared so solid against Pike, yet I could not fathom his reasoning. "One final question, mon ami," Poirot said, turning back to face Jap. "This mantel clock that Pike claims to have been repairing, did you examine it?" "Well, no, not specifically. Lady Margaret said she hadn't asked him to repair anything, so I assumed." "Assumptions," Poirot observed gently. "They are the mother of all mistakes, are they not?" Jap's face reddened slightly at this mild rebuke. "Are you suggesting Pike might be telling the truth about the clock?" "I am suggesting, mon bon Jap, that we should verify all facts before reaching conclusions. Perhaps a visit to Lady Margaret's drawing-room would be illuminating." As we prepared to return to Bishopsgate Square, I found myself uncertain what to think. The case against Pike seemed overwhelming, means, motive, and opportunity all clearly established. Yet Poirot's subtle questioning had introduced elements of doubt that I could not entirely dismiss. In my experience, when Hercule Poirot began asking seemingly innocent questions about details others had overlooked, it usually meant that the obvious solution was far from the correct one. The fog was beginning to thicken again as our taxi approached the square, and the gas lamps were already being lit despite the early hour. In their flickering light, the houses seemed to huddle together like conspirators sharing secrets, while the ancient church tower loomed above them all like a silent, disapproving judge. Chapter 5. Affairs of the Heart. Our return to Bishopsgate Square was delayed by an unexpected visitor to Poirot's flat. Miss Beatrice Lyle stood in the hallway, her dark coat damp from the thickening fog, her face pale with evident distress. Miss Lemon had admitted her reluctantly, for it was well past the usual hours for social calls. "Mr. Poirot," she began, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion, "I must speak with you privately. There are things I should have told you yesterday, but I couldn't find the courage." Poirot regarded her with his characteristic blend of kindness and keen observation. "Naturally, mademoiselle. Please take a seat. Hastings, perhaps you would be so good as to ask Miss Lemon to prepare some tea." When I returned from this errand, Miss Lyle was seated on the edge of her chair, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. The bundle of letters I had glimpsed in her quarters now lay on Poirot's desk, the ribbon that had bound them trembling slightly in the draught from the window. "I must tell you about Sir Reginald and myself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That is to say, there was an understanding between us." I confess that this revelation, while not entirely unexpected, filled me with the familiar stirring of romantic intrigue that such matters always provoked. Here was the classic triangle, the wealthy, powerful man, the vulnerable young woman in his employ, and the tragic end that had befallen their illicit affair. "The letters," Poirot said gently. "They are from Sir Reginald." Miss Lyle nodded, her cheeks flushing with shame. "It began innocently enough. Sir Reginald would call upon the Pembertons frequently, and we would sometimes find ourselves alone while they attended to business matters. He was charming, attentive, so different from the cold, calculating man others saw." "And these attentions they were welcome to you?" "At first, yes." Miss Lyle's voice grew stronger as she continued. "You must understand, Mr. Poirot, my position is precarious. I am entirely dependent upon the Pembertons' goodwill, with no family of my own and few prospects for the future. When Sir Reginald suggested that he might provide for me, might offer me a different kind of life." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Poirot nodded with understanding, his expression compassionate rather than judgmental. "But the relationship, it did not progress as you had hoped?" "No." The word came out as a bitter laugh. "Sir Reginald made grand promises, spoke of establishments he would set up for me, of trips to the continent. But when I began to press him for some concrete commitment, some sign that his intentions were honourable, he became different." "Different in what way?" Miss Lyle's hands twisted in her lap, cold, calculating. "He made it clear that I was to be nothing more than a temporary diversion, that his wife and Social's position were far too important to risk for someone of my station." "And when did this change occur?" "About 6 weeks ago. I had written to him, you see, suggesting that we should either formalize our arrangement or end it entirely. His response was—" She gestured toward the letters with a shuddering motion. "Cruel, dismissive. He told me to be grateful for what little attention he had shown me and to expect nothing more." I found myself moved by her obvious distress, though I could not help but wonder at the timing. 6 weeks would place this rejection shortly before Sir Reginald's death, ample time for wounded love to transform into something more dangerous. "And your emotional state following this rejection?" Poirot inquired, his tone remaining carefully neutral. "I was devastated," Miss Lyle admitted. "I had built such hopes around our relationship, such dreams of a different future. To have them shattered so callously." She looked up suddenly, her eyes wide with alarm. "But surely you don't think I could have harmed him?" "I am not a violent person, Mr. Poirot." "Of course not, mademoiselle. But perhaps you sought advice, consolation from someone else in the square?" Miss Lyle's face coloured again, but this time with embarrassment rather than shame. "Dr. Carroway has been kind to me. When I found myself unable to sleep, unable to eat properly, he provided some medication to help calm my nerves." "Ah," said Poirot, his interest sharpening. "And Dr. Carroway, he was aware of the nature of your distress?" "I confided in him, yes. He was most sympathetic, most understanding. He said that men like Sir Reginald viewed women of my class as little more than objects for their amusement. This information cast the nervous doctor in a new light. His obvious medical knowledge, combined with romantic feelings toward Miss Lyle and intimate knowledge of her mistreatment, provided yet another compelling motive for murder. Did Dr. Carroway ever suggest any direct action against Sir Reginald? "Oh, no," Miss Lyle protested quickly. "He is far too gentle a man for such thoughts. He merely listened and provided what medical comfort he could." After Miss Lyle departed, Poirot sat in thoughtful silence, the letters spread before him on his desk. I took the liberty of examining them more closely and found them to be exactly as she had described, beginning with passionate declarations and ending with cold dismissal. "Well, Poirot," I said, "it seems we now have a second suspect with equally compelling motives." The governess, scorned by her lover, aided perhaps by a physician who harbours romantic feelings toward her. "Indeed, mon ami, and what think you of this Dr. Carroway, a man who has fallen from the heights of Harley Street to a modest practice in a decaying square? What might drive such a man to desperate measures?" Before I could respond, Inspector Japp arrived with news that deepened the mystery further. His investigation into Dr. Carroway's background had revealed the scandal that had destroyed his London practice, allegations of performing illegal procedures for wealthy women who found themselves in delicate circumstances. Sir Reginald was behind the exposure, Japp explained grimly, used his political connections to ensure the story reached the right ears. Carroway lost his license for 6 months, lost his practice permanently, and has been struggling to rebuild his career ever since. And yet Sir Reginald permitted him to practice in Bishopsgate Square. That's the interesting part, Japp continued. According to the residents, Sir Reginald actually recommended Carroway for the position, said the square needed a resident physician and Carroway's fees would be more reasonable than those of a more successful practitioner. The implications were chilling. Sir Reginald had not merely destroyed Dr. Carroway's career, he had then dangled him like a puppet, keeping him dependent and grateful, while maintaining the power to destroy him again, at will. "Most ingenious," murmured Poirot. "Sir Reginald, he collected people as well as information, did he not? Each resident of the square bound to him by some thread of obligation or fear." As evening fell and the fog thickened once more around Bishopsgate Square, I found myself wondering how many more secrets lay hidden beneath its decaying facade. The case had grown more complex with each revelation, yet somehow I sensed we were still far from understanding the full truth behind Sir Reginald Hawthorne's carefully orchestrated demise. Chapter 6. The Doctor's Diagnosis. The following morning brought with it a development that seemed to resolve all our questions, though in a manner I had not quite anticipated. Dr. Carroway arrived at Poirot's flat in a state of complete nervous collapse, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely hold his medical bag, his face the colour of ash. "I cannot bear it any longer," he declared without preamble, sinking into the chair that Poirot silently indicated. "The weight of guilt, the constant fear of discovery, it has become unbearable." Inspector Japp, who had arrived only moments before the doctor, leaned forward with the keen interest of a bloodhound scenting its quarry. "Are you saying you wish to make a confession, Dr. Carroway?" "I am saying," the doctor replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "that Sir Reginald Hawthorne deserved everything that befell him, and more besides." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and I felt the familiar thrill that accompanies the moment when a complex mystery begins to resolve itself into clear, comprehensible facts. Here was our murderer, driven to confession by the very conscience that had made the crime necessary in the first place. Poirot, however, remained perfectly still, his green eyes fixed upon the doctor with an intensity that suggested his thoughts were working along entirely different lines. "You speak of desert, Doctor, but not yet of deed. Perhaps you would be so good as to tell us exactly what occurred on the evening of Sir Reginald's death." Dr. Carroway's narrative, when it finally emerged through his stammering and self-reproach, painted a picture of calculated revenge born from years of systematic humiliation. Sir Reginald had not merely destroyed his career, the doctor explained. He had made himself indispensable to the residents of Bishopsgate Square, then used that position to extract a slow, subtle vengeance from each of them. "He knew about my past, you see," Dr. Carroway continued, his medical training allowing him to speak with clinical detachment even about his own degradation. "Not just the scandal that ruined my practice, but other things, mistakes I had made, patients I had failed to save, debts I could not repay. He would remind me of these failures at every opportunity, always with that cold smile of his." "And Miss Lyle's situation, you were aware of Sir Reginald's treatment of her?" At mention of the governess, Dr. Carroway's composure cracked entirely. "That innocent child," he said, his voice breaking, "to use her so callously, to raise her hopes only to dash them for his own amusement. It was unconscionable. When she came to me in such distress, when I saw what his cruelty had done to her—" "You decided that Sir Reginald must pay for his crimes?" "I decided," Dr. Carroway said with sudden firmness, "that the world would be a better place without him in it." The confession that followed seemed to answer every question that had puzzled us. Dr. Carroway described how he had used his medical knowledge to determine the exact force and angle necessary to deliver a fatal blow, how his frequent house calls had given him intimate knowledge of every resident's routine, how his access to medications had allowed him to ensure Sir Reginald would be in the right place at the right time. "I arranged to meet him at the gates under the pretense of discussing Miss Lyle's condition," he explained. "I told him I believed she was becoming dangerously unstable, that she might do something rash if her situation was not handled delicately. He came, of course, not out of concern for her welfare, but because he enjoyed the power he held over her fate." "And the church bells?" "A simple matter of mechanical timing. I had studied the mechanism during my visits to comfort the elderly parishioners, a small device easily constructed and concealed, designed to create the impression that the murder had occurred at a specific moment when all residents would have alibis." Inspector Japp was writing furiously in his notebook, clearly satisfied that the case was now closed. The doctor's confession covered every aspect of the crime, from motive through method to opportunity. Even I found myself convinced by the logic of it all. The physician's intimate knowledge of anatomy, his access to the square, his obvious distress over Miss Lyle's treatment. Yet Poirot remained silent throughout this recitation, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. When Dr. Carroway finally concluded his confession with a formal request to be taken into custody, Poirot held up one small, perfectly manicured hand. "Un moment, Doctor. Your account is most thorough, most convincing in its details. Yet there are one or two small points that puzzle me." Dr. Carroway looked up sharply, his face showing a flicker of something that might have been relief rather than concern. "What points, Mr. Poirot?" "The matter of the Latin message, for instance. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes. You have not mentioned this detail in your confession." That is to say, I thought it appropriate. A commentary on Sir Reginald's character, his assumption that he could act as judge and jury over others with impunity." "Ah, yes. And your knowledge of Latin, it is extensive?" For the first time, Dr. Carroway hesitated. "I had the usual classical education, of course. Public school, you understand." "Of course." "Yet this particular quotation from Juvenal's satires, I believe, it requires rather more than a usual classical education to recall with such precision, does it not? I watched as uncertainty crept across the doctor's features. His hands, which had been steady during his confession, began to tremble once more. And then there is the matter of the bell mechanism, Poirot continued gently. Most ingenious, as I mentioned to Hastings, yet the construction required not merely mechanical knowledge, but quite specific expertise in clockwork timing mechanisms. Your medical training, excellent though it doubtless was, would hardly have prepared you for such precise mechanical work. Dr. Carroway's face had grown pale again, but this time with a different sort of distress. I had help. That is to say, I consulted with someone more knowledgeable about such matters. Indeed. And this someone they were willing accomplices to murder? The question hung in the air unanswered, and I began to sense that Poirot's gentle probing had revealed fundamental flaws in what had seemed like a perfect confession. The doctor's obvious genuine distress over Miss Lyle's treatment, his intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's cruelty, his clear capability for the medical aspects of the crime, all these were undoubtedly real. Yet the mechanical precision of the murder, the classical scholarship of the Latin message, the perfect timing that had brought all residents to witness the discovery, these suggested a different sort of mind entirely. As the afternoon light faded outside Poirot's windows, I realized that we were no closer to the truth than we had been at the beginning, despite having heard two separate confessions. Indeed, the very willingness of both Pike and Dr. Carroway to accept guilt for the crime suggested that the real murderer remained not only undetected, but perhaps unsuspected by all save Hercule Poirot himself. Chapter 7. The Watchman's Watch. The gathering in Lady Margaret's drawing-room that evening possessed all the theatrical quality that Poirot so relished in his final revelations. The residents of Bishopsgate Square sat in the same chairs they had occupied on that first night, but now the atmosphere crackled with tension rather than mere curiosity. Dr. Carroway appeared haggard from his earlier confession, while Arthur Pike sat with the stoic resignation of a man who believed his fate already sealed. Inspector Japp had initially protested the necessity of this assembly, arguing that Dr. Carroway's confession had resolved the matter satisfactorily. Yet something in Poirot's manner had convinced him to humour my friend's theatrical instincts one final time. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, rising from his chair with ceremonial gravity, "we are gathered here tonight to discuss the death of Sir Reginald Hawthorne, a death which, on the surface, appeared to be the result of a robbery gone wrong, but which we now know was carefully planned and executed with considerable ingenuity." Lady Margaret sat perfectly upright in her chair, her hands folded in her lap with the same precision she had displayed throughout our investigation. Miss Lyle clutched her handkerchief and avoided meeting anyone's eyes directly. Pike stared at the floor with the dull acceptance of a man who had given up hope. "Dr. Carroway has confessed to this crime," Poirot continued, "and his confession contains many elements of truth. He had motive, years of systematic humiliation at Sir Reginald's hands. He had opportunity, his medical practice gave him access to all residents and their routines. He had the knowledge necessary to strike a fatal blow with precision." Dr. Carroway shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but said nothing. His earlier breakdown had left him drained, and he seemed to be waiting for the inevitable conclusion with weary resignation. "Yet," Poirot said, his voice taking on the particular tone he employed when beginning to demolish a seemingly perfect solution, "there are certain aspects of this crime that suggest a different hand entirely. The Latin quotation, for instance, quis custodiet ipsos custodis, who watches the watchman? This is not merely a classical reference, but a very specific one, requiring intimate familiarity with Juvenal's work. He moved to Lady Margaret's bookshelf and withdrew the volume of Juvenal we had observed during our earlier visit. The very same quotation, annotated in the margin by a scholar's hand. The handwriting, I believe, of your late husband, Lady Margaret? Lady Margaret's composure remained perfect, but I noticed the slightest tightening around her eyes. My husband was indeed a classical scholar, Mr. Poirot. Many educated persons would recognize that quotation. Ah, but not the specific context, madame. This particular passage deals with the corruption of those in authority, the danger of placing too much power in the hands of men who are themselves fallible. Most fitting for Sir Reginald's situation. Would you not agree? I wouldn't know, Lady Margaret replied coolly. I'm not a student of Roman satire. Poirot smiled gently. Perhaps not. But you are a student of human nature and a very keen observer of the corruption that power brings. You knew, did you not, about Sir Reginald's systematic collection of damaging information about each resident, his use of this knowledge to maintain control over your small community? Sir Reginald was not a popular man, Lady Margaret conceded. His business methods were aggressive. More than aggressive, I think. Let me present what I believe to be the truth of Dr. Carraway's confession. Poirot returned to the centre of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. The good doctor did indeed plan to kill Sir Reginald. His distress over Miss Lyle's treatment, combined with years of personal humiliation, had driven him to contemplate murder. He even went so far as to arrange a meeting with Sir Reginald at the gates of the square. Dr. Carraway's head jerked up in surprise. But that is to say, you arranged the meeting, mon bon doctor, but you did not keep it. Something prevented you, perhaps a last-minute failure of nerve, perhaps a genuine medical emergency that required your attention. Sir Reginald arrived at the appointed time and found not his intended killer, but someone else entirely. The room had grown very quiet. Even the usual sounds from the street outside seemed muted, as though the very air was holding its breath. Someone who had discovered Dr. Carraway's plan, Poirot continued, someone who realized that this provided the perfect opportunity to rid the square of its tormentor while ensuring that suspicion would fall elsewhere. Someone with the mechanical knowledge to construct the delayed bell mechanism, the classical education to choose an appropriate Latin quotation, and the cold intelligence to stage the entire scene with theatrical precision. I found myself looking from face to face, trying to read the expressions of our assembled suspects. Pike appeared genuinely puzzled by this turn in Poirot's narrative. Miss Lyle seemed barely to be following the discussion. Dr. Carraway looked both relieved and confused. Only Lady Margaret maintained her perfect composure, though I thought I detected the faintest trace of admiration in her eyes as she regarded Poirot. The bell mechanism, Poirot explained, required not medical knowledge but the sort of practical engineering skills that might be acquired by someone who had spent years managing a large estate, dealing with all manner of mechanical systems and timing devices. The Latin quotation required not a casual classical education, but intimate familiarity with specific texts, the sort of knowledge that comes from years of living with a classical scholar. He paused, allowing the implications to settle over the room like a shroud. Most importantly, this crime required something that neither Dr. Carraway nor Mr. Pike possessed, a complete understanding of Sir Reginald's true plans for Bishopsgate Square. Plans that would have displaced every resident within months, destroying not just individual lives but the entire character of this small community. Lady Margaret's hands, I noticed, had tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. For the first time since I had known her, her perfect aristocratic composure showed the tiniest crack. The ancient house seemed to settle around us with a sigh, its old timbers creaking in the evening wind, while outside the fog pressed against the windows like curious spectators eager to witness the final act of our domestic tragedy. Chapter 8. The Final Toll. "Lady Margaret Ashworth," Poirot said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "you murdered Sir Reginald Hawthorne." The words fell into the silence of the drawing-room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to emanate from each listener. Miss Lyle gasped audibly, her handkerchief pressed to her lips. Dr. Carroway stared in bewilderment, while Arthur Pike's honest face registered complete incomprehension. Only Lady Margaret herself remained unmoved, her aristocratic features as composed as marble. For a long moment she regarded Poirot with what might almost have been approval, as though acknowledging a worthy opponent who had played the game according to proper rules. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Poirot," she said finally, her voice carrying its usual measured dignity. "I trust you have more than mere speculation to support it." "Indeed I do, madame. Shall I present the evidence?" "First, the matter of knowledge. You alone among the residents possessed complete understanding of Sir Reginald's scheme to sell the square's properties to foreign investors. Your late husband's business papers, carefully preserved in your study, contained detailed correspondence about these transactions." Poirot moved to Lady Margaret's writing desk and withdrew several documents that had been concealed beneath other papers. Sir Reginald was not merely planning to displace a few residents, but to destroy the entire character of Bishopsgate Square. The buyers he had found intended to demolish these historic houses and construct modern commercial buildings. Inspector Japp leaned forward to examine the papers, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Good Lord," he muttered, "the whole square was to be razed within 6 months." "Precisely. Lady Margaret discovered this through her husband's old business connections. Sir Reginald had involved her late husband in the preliminary negotiations years ago, before his death. When she realized the scope of the betrayal, she knew that legal remedies would be insufficient and far too slow." Lady Margaret's composure finally showed signs of strain. "My husband trusted Sir Reginald," she said, her voice carrying the first hint of emotion I had heard from her. "They had been friends since university. When Harold died, I thought that friendship would provide some protection for his widow. But Sir Reginald saw only opportunity in your vulnerability," Poirot observed gently. "He accelerated his plans, knowing you lacked the resources to oppose him effectively through conventional means." "You speak of motive, Mr. Poirot," Lady Margaret said, recovering her equilibrium. "But surely that alone is insufficient for such an accusation." "Ah, but there is so much more, madame. The mechanical expertise required for the bell mechanism. You managed your husband's estate for many years before his death, dealing with all manner of clockwork and timing systems. The groundskeeper's records, which Inspector Japp was kind enough to review, show numerous repairs to estate clocks and mechanical devices under your supervision." Poirot produced a small notebook from his waistcoat pocket. "Then there is the matter of the Latin quotation. Not only did you possess your husband's annotated Juvenal, but the specific passage chosen reveals intimate knowledge of the text's context. Who watches the watchman? A perfect commentary on Sir Reginald's assumption that he could act as arbiter of everyone's fate without oversight. Many educated people know that quotation," Lady Margaret protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps, but the paper on which it was written, high quality, with a distinctive watermark, matched exactly the stationery in your writing desk. Moreover, the handwriting, while disguised, showed certain characteristic formations that graphology experts would find most illuminating." Dr. Carroway found his voice at last, but my confession I admitted to the crime. How can you be certain I was not telling the truth? Because, mon bon docteur, your confession contained one fatal flaw. You claim to have used your medical knowledge to strike the fatal blow with precision. Yet the autopsy revealed that Sir Reginald was not killed by medical expertise, but by multiple blows delivered with considerable force and evident emotion. This was not the calculated strike of a physician, but the passionate attack of someone driven beyond endurance. Poirot turned back to Lady Margaret. You discovered Dr. Carraway's plan through your position as the Square's unofficial matriarch. He confided his intentions to someone, perhaps Miss Lyle, and word reached you. You realized this provided the perfect opportunity to remove Sir Reginald while ensuring suspicion would fall elsewhere. The method was ingenious in its simplicity. You sent word to Sir Reginald that Dr. Carraway wished to meet him at the gates, using the doctor's name, but not his handwriting. You rigged the bell mechanism to ring at the moment of discovery, ensuring all residents would have witnesses to their whereabouts. Then you waited. Lady Margaret's hands had begun to tremble, almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her dignified posture. And what, according to your theory, happened when Sir Reginald arrived? You confronted him with the evidence of his betrayal. Perhaps you hoped even then that he might reconsider his plans, show some mercy for old friendship's sake. But Sir Reginald was not a man given to mercy, was he? For the first time, Lady Margaret's perfect control cracked entirely. He laughed. She whispered, her voice filled with a pain so raw it was almost unbearable to witness. When I showed him Harold's letters, when I begged him to consider what his scheme would do to the people who had trusted him, he laughed. He said Harold had always been too sentimental for business, and that I had inherited the same weakness. The confession that followed came in broken phrases, each word torn from her like a physical wound. She described how Sir Reginald had mocked not only her husband's memory, but her own reduced circumstances, how he had suggested she might find accommodation in a boarding house once the square was demolished. I struck him with his own walking cane, she said finally, again and again until he stopped laughing. Then I arranged the scene to suggest robbery, planted the Latin message I had prepared, and returned to my house to wait for the bells to toll. Inspector Japp rose slowly from his chair, his expression heavy with reluctant duty. Lady Margaret Ashworth, I must ask you to accompany me to the station. She stood with the same grace she had maintained throughout our investigation, her bearing unchanged despite the handcuffs Japp placed carefully around her wrists. As they prepared to leave, she turned back to address the assembled residents one final time. I regret the deception, she said quietly, but I do not regret the deed. Sir Reginald's scheme would have destroyed not just our homes, but everything this place has meant to us. Sometimes the law is insufficient to protect what truly matters. As the police departed with their prisoner, the remaining residents sat in stunned silence. Dr. Carraway wept openly, whether from relief or grief I could not determine. Miss Lyle stared at her hands, while Arthur Pike shook his head in bewildered disbelief. Outside, the church bells began to toll the hour, not from any mechanical device, but rung properly by the old vicar in the traditional manner. The sound echoed across Bishopsgate Square, where the gas lamps flickered through the thinning fog, casting their eternal vigil over a community that would survive, at least for now, though forever changed by the events of these few dark November days. As Poirot and I walked back through the London streets, I found myself reflecting on Lady Margaret's final words. In the cold light of justice, her actions were clearly those of a murderer. Yet in the warmer glow of human understanding, they seemed those of a protector who had chosen the only path available to preserve something precious and irreplaceable. It was, I thought, exactly the sort of moral complexity that made Hercule Poirot such a remarkable judge of human nature, and such an extraordinary detective. And so our tale concludes in the faded elegance of Lady Margaret's drawing room, where Poirot has once again demonstrated that even the most desperate acts of protection cannot escape the penetrating gaze of his little grey cells. What did you think of this mystery? Were you able to solve it alongside the great detective? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and theories about this episode. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like and subscribe for more detective stories. Your support helps me continue bringing these mysteries to life. Until next time, keep your wits sharp and your curiosity